Hi, everyone. Hope everyone is good. Today, we're going to talk about planning. So, I've received a few questions about how to make this work over time and what a plan actually looks like. So, I tend to focus on workouts because that's where the action really is. And if you're not effective at actually creating change within a workout, then you can't really organize a plan as to how to do that over time. The first step is to really identify the skills and then get good at actually influencing those skills. So that's the first step. But after that, you do need to organize things over a longer period of time so that you can get progressive changes, because obviously things aren't going to happen right away on the first try. And you can't just keep doing the same thing over and over again. You got to increase the challenge somehow. So how do you do that? Today, we're going to go over a slightly different perspective on planning and how to integrate skill development into that. But the good thing is you don't really have to change your training plan in order to make that happen. You just have to kind of change how you think about the process. So regardless of how you train, you can use the same basic approach to integrate skills. Obviously, the training itself is going to be very different from coach to coach, depending on how you like to set things up. Now, I like simple things because if it's simple, then you can start to put it into action. And so we're going to start with a really simple concept, and then we'll kind of go from there and flesh things out. But when you get confused, you can always come back to this simple concept because that's what it's really all about. So it's a two-step process. Number one is get a change. So the first thing, none of this matters, is if you can't get the skills to change a little bit, there's no sense in planning anything from that point on. That's the first thing. You got to get things to change, and that's why the workouts and an individual workout is really important, and having the right strategies to influence skills is so important because that's the starting point. Then, once you get a change, it's simply a matter of challenging that change in progressively more difficult situations. And so that's all you're really doing. Get a change and then challenge it. And where the planning comes in is in terms of how you're challenging it. Because what we really want is for that skill to hold up in competition. And in order to do that, it needs to be challenged to the demands of competition. So get the change and then challenge it in progressively more difficult situations. Let's add a little bit of depth to that. Think about it in terms of 3 steps now. So the first thing is do it right, so you get the change. And then the next step is you're going to practice doing it faster and longer. So the faster stuff, you're just adding some speed to the changes. It's not under fatigue, it's not for long distances, it's just a little bit more speed. Because if swimmers can execute their skills faster, that's ultimately what they're going to need to be able to do in a race. Second thing is do things a little bit longer. So they have to execute the skills for a longer period of time. So it doesn't have to be fast, but you're just trying to be able to develop some sustainability of those skills. Because if they can only do it once, or they can only do it for a 50, that's not going to really serve them very well in a race. They have to be able to sustain those skills a little bit longer. Those 2 steps can happen at the same time because they don't really compete with each other. You can work on both of those and it doesn't really cause any problems. And then the last step is kind of do it harder. So now they've got some speed, they've got some basic endurance, and now it's time to challenge that with more fatigue. And so that's what's going to be more of your race preparation stuff. And so any sort of race pace stuff, it's going to be fast, it's going to be long, and it's going to be hard. That's going to be the biggest challenge for the athletes to be able to execute their skills. And it's important to do that a little bit later in the process because if they don't have any speed, they don't have any endurance, they're not going to be able to do any of the race stuff. So you got to work on the speed and the endurance stuff before you get into the race stuff, because once you do go to the race stuff, they'll be much more prepared to be successful. So that's basically it from an overview standpoint. So you first stage, do it right, and then the next stage, you're kind of doing it faster and you're doing it longer, and those are separate processes. And then the third stage, you're going to put it all together and you're asking for speed over longer periods of time in challenging situations where there's going to be fatigue, just like a race. And so that's ultimately what you're building towards. And remember, when we're talking about skills, what you ultimately want is you want the most effective skills to show up in races, and you want them to be able to sustain their skills over the course of a race. So that's the end goal. So you're working backwards from there. So the step before that is you're going to have to train in those type of race situations. And the step before that, you're going to want to develop speed and endurance because that's what's necessary to do the race stuff. And before that, you need to make sure that they do it right. So it's a simple way to think about training in terms of the skills that you have to practice and how you can prepare those skills to be able to be executed in races. Now, to give you a little bit more context in terms of how this compares to traditional planning based mostly on training. So the first stage in a typical training process, it's a preseason, you're just getting used to swimming, you're just kind of doing some low intensity stuff, you're just kind of getting back into it. Well, that's when you focus on getting things right. That's where you focus on really creating some change in how your swimmers are moving through the water. And so those 2 phases are more or less the same. And then the second stage of a training process is usually some sort of base building. Regardless of how you train, there's some sort of base building. You're trying to build a little bit of endurance, you're trying to build some speed. Those are the two bases of performance. And so different coaches will emphasize one over the other. They'll do more of one, less of the other, or they'll almost emphasize one exclusively. However, athletes are going to need to work on their speed and their basic endurance. And then when viewed from the skill standpoint, you're just challenging the skills with a little bit of speed, and you're challenging the skills with a little bit of endurance. And so it's the same basic process. It's just framed a little bit differently. Instead of just thinking about it in terms of physiology, you're now thinking about it in terms of this impact on skills. And then get more towards the second half of the season, most coaches are going to start doing more and more race pace type of training. When viewed from a skill perspective, now you're challenging their skills to hold up in race situations. And so it's the same basic stuff. So even for coaches that introduce race-paced training earlier in the training process, as you move through the process, that type of training is going to be harder and more difficult. So regardless of when you start the process, it's the same basic concept. You're challenging their skills in more and more and more difficult situations. And when it comes down to it, if they can execute their skills at high speed and with fatigue, they're going to be race ready, and the skills are going to be race ready, and their physiology is going to be race ready, because the necessary training is going to have had to take place in order to maintain those skills. And so in that way, you get the best of both worlds. You've got skill development and you've got the training outcomes you want. Now, when it comes to transitions between these phases, it's the same thing with your training plan. It's not like it's black and white. You go from one to one to one. There's usually a smooth transition from one to the other. You don't just go from focusing entirely on aerobic stuff to focusing entirely on race-paced training. You blend the two. And the same thing happens when you're focused on skill development. You can start everything early in the process. It's just what you're focusing on at a given time is what's important. And you'll see that in most training plans, the same thing happens with skill development. They're all present at all times. It's just the emphasis that changes. So what's valuable about this framework is that you don't have to change how you train. You do the same things. You just add skill development to that process. So all the sets I've shared with you have all taken place at different parts of the process. So the ones that are focused more on race-paced stuff, that's going to be done more towards the end of the year. The ones that are focused a little bit more on speed and endurance, a little bit more towards the early portions of the year. It really just depends, and you can use any of them at any time. It's more about having a general progression of where you're moving towards. And so rather than thinking about your training plan as just developing physiology, it's you're developing physiology and your training skills in more and more difficult situations. Training generally takes place in more and more difficult situations, so the two processes are really the same. You just integrate skill development from day one, and the training plan unfolds as it normally does. So I'll give you a couple examples of what different sets might look like at different points of the season. And these are just off the cuff, so they're purely examples, and they're super simple. So early in the season, you might just be trying to establish stroke counts for athletes. They're just getting used to the concepts. So it could be as simple as 3 times 450s, take one less stroke per 50, do that 4 times. You're just introducing them to the stroke count. There's not really any challenge. Now, early in the season developing speed, it could be 2 sets of 4 25s. They're going to hold the same stroke count on each set of 4, and they're going to try to descend 1 to 4 to as fast as they can. The second set of 4, they can take an extra stroke. That way they go a little bit faster. Again, super simple, and then you can just go from there, adding more speed as you go. Endurance side, it could be you start off with 8 100s on 20 seconds rest. Just be consistent with whatever stroke count you can hit, and just make sure that you're maintaining that throughout the course of 100. Later on, it could be something like 10 200s, where the odds are negative split at the same stroke count, and the evens are take one less stroke per 50 within that 200. A little bit more of a challenge, but still an emphasis on maintaining and sustaining stroke count. When you get to pace stuff, an early pace set could be 2 sets of 450s. They're going to go at pace plus 2, and they're going to try to do it in as few strokes as possible. The first round's at pace plus 2, the second round's at pace plus 1. Something that you should be able to do, and you're starting to integrate that stroke count into the same race pace type of work. Later on, it could be something like 2 sets of 650s pace on a pretty tight interval, and the odds, they're going to go at pace at 1 less stroke than they would normally take, and then the evens are at pace minus 1, but they can take their normal stroke count. That way you're integrating speed and stroke count, and you're challenging them physically. So those are just some simple examples. Obviously, you can do way more with that than what I just rattled off, and there's plenty of other skills other than stroke count that you want to incorporate in what you're doing. So hopefully that gave you a simple and actionable strategy for how to plan some of these things over time. You have to go beyond the workouts, because if you don't have a plan and you're just doing things haphazardly, it's not going to work nearly as well as if you progress things in a manner that makes sense. So again, keep it really simple for yourself. The first thing is create a change. And then the second thing is progressively challenge that change over time. If you want to go a little bit deeper, it's the first thing they need to do is get it right. And then they need to work on doing it well with speed and some endurance. And the last thing is to do it under pressure with fatigue, with harder efforts, so that they can become bulletproof and they can hold their skills together when they get tired. So I hope that helped. If you have any questions, absolutely let me know. And I look forward to talking again soon. Take care.